My microphone and camera. Hand over to you. Enjoy your session. And
Brilliant. Thank you, Sean, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, depending on where you are. So this talk is about can-do statements. I have a question for the chat box straight off the bat. Can anyone guess what the relationship is between the two photos that you can see on the opening slide? Before there was just 5 of the 58 people who replied to Sean's question. I wonder if both taken in Moscow, Sean? Not quite. They're not. See what David says. A Q. See what anyone else says. It's all key to the presentation. Both show stressful situations. Thank you. Both require test. That's a good point, Sean. It's not the answer. The connection between them both is, or maybe I should say, is that there's a lack of progress in both. So students often feel there's a lack of progress, and obviously people stuck in traffic feel there's a lack of progress. And that is how we came up with the idea of trialing can-do statements here at International House Moscow. Now this slide's gone a bit wrong, but a can-do statement, as we interpreted it, is just basically the communicative aim of the lesson. So the reason why you would use the grammar, so what's the communicative outcome of the grammar? So it might be something as simple as describe past experiences using the present perfect. And can-do statements are actually what is used in the CEFR, the Common European Framework Reference for Languages, that describes what's A1, what's A2, B1, B2, etc., in order to show what a student can do at these levels. So the idea is, if you can tell a student at the start of the lesson what the lesson will enable them to do, then when you give feedback at the end of the lesson, when you talk about a student's progress, you can use the can-do statements to show them, well, before you couldn't do this, and now you can do this. So the keen-eyed amongst you will be able to discern some of these statements. For example, describe a recent holiday using the past simple, discuss your family, lifestyle, work, and education using expressions with go, request information, etc., compare Moscow and other world cities using comparatives and superlatives. So putting these on the board at the start of the lesson, or telling the students before you were to begin the class, is in order to help them realize that by being in the class and partaking in the activities that they're going to do will help them make progress. So that was what we decided. And I'm about to tell you how we did it, and then also what some of the feedback was from our teachers after what's been 9 months now of using can-do statements, and how they found them, how they experimented with them, and of course what we still have to do in order to make it more widely spread within IH Moscow. So at first we decided that we should have an action plan. So first we should raise awareness of what, or the first idea was to raise awareness of what can-do statements were, because a lot of teachers just didn't know. So we started this in September in order to be prepared for October, when the majority of our classes would start, and then kind of reduce the objectives of each level so that teachers would find it easier in order to work with the statements and be able to formulate them themselves. And we did this through teacher training sessions, which happen in Moscow once a month on a Saturday. Longer term, or thinking longer term, we included it in the on the observation forms. So in each feedback session after an observation, we'd bring up can-do statements and ask about whether a teacher could use them, how they might use them. And then we'd organize as well feedback sessions and see whether students and teachers made reference to them and how they found them. So that was the plan going forward. I don't know if you can see this poster here on the right. So we put up posters in each school for each level, and the idea was in the bottom part, it described the syllabus, basically, for each of the CEFR levels. So again, A1 through to C2. And it described maybe the reading texts that are in each book, or of the core text that we use here, the listening activities, but also the skills that students need in order to complete the task. So it might be, for example, listen for detail, or or differentiate between information and supporting arguments, or something like that. And then also gave teachers a list of verbs that they could use in order to describe what was going to happen. So, as I said before, we gave one workshop at a Saturday seminar, which is our teacher training inset sessions. And I also asked for a trial group, essentially, a group of teachers who would be willing to experiment a bit more, be willing to give feedback. And I gave a special session, a training session, to them here at the school. And then the posters were put up in different schools, displayed in teachers' rooms, so teachers could refer to them and would be encouraged, as we say, to give them a go. Maybe because of the posters, but maybe because it would come up as well in observations, and we'd talk about it in feedback. And then we had 2 data collection points. The first was in January, so at this stage they would have been using can-do statements for about 4 months. And then now, basically, we've just finished collecting data. And again, asking teachers about their experiences, whether they had any questions, how they thought it had changed their teaching, improved their teaching, but most importantly, not forgetting the main aim was, how do we communicate to students what we're doing in class in order for them to realize the progress that they are making. And that was the central aim of the can-do statements, but what we could do to make students realize that it might be small and incremental, but that they were certainly making progress. So what happened is teachers were quite enthusiastic, especially from the trial group. Here I've got 3 examples of how teachers use them, thanks to the 3 teachers who gave me permission to use these photos. So I think there's 1 in English, 1 in Spanish, and 1 in French, and they're used in slightly different ways. So the board on the left, the teacher underlined the main use of the grammar for the class. You've got the Spanish teacher in the middle, who listed the cohesive devices that they were going to use, and also wrote them in different colors, and then wrote them in the same colors when completing the activity on the board. And then you've got the French on the right, who again used them in the same way that I did from the outset. Describe what you do in your free time using a certain tense. I think it's using describe past experiences using the passé composé. So that was quite good. That was quite unexpected, but teachers, when we asked for feedback, were quite enthusiastic to say, look, I'm making this change, and I'm trying to transmit it to students from the start of the lesson. And then so just this, this month, we've asked for a bigger feedback than before, and we got more responses than before. Of course, it wasn't all good, but let's start off on a positive note. I'm sure everyone can read here. But so one teacher said that it made them more focused, and it made the class more focused. So quite unexpectedly, what happened is teachers found the can-do statements helped them plan, especially when planning, when going through different stages of the lesson and thinking about how they'd start presenting something to the students and how they'd get to their communicative task at the end. The can-do statement kind of helped them weave a coherent thread through the lesson. And also, it helped students realize how much they would learn, but also manage their expectations, which is quite a positive thing. So I think as well, an unexpected bonus for one teacher was that as well they were able to break up the aims and better transmit it to students as the lesson went on, which was quite positive. One thing I was very happy to hear about was that students started to take more of an interest in what they were going to be doing during the lesson. And I found this when I've used them, that students sometimes come in and write them down at the top of their notepad. And this happened with another teacher as well. Students come in and the first thing they do is look on the board and know what they're going to do. So that's quite a nice habit to get into. And I think that was, of course, that was our principal aim, but it's quite nice that students were able to take it on board, especially when you often hear the complaints that I don't think I'm making progress, or showing students what you're going to do and helping them reflect on what they have done. Well, that was our principal aim. So it was really quite comforting to see that it turned out that way. However, it's not job done. Some teachers only use them with certain classes. We found that with lower levels, with teenagers and with young learners especially, that it's more difficult to implement can-do statements. And some students, irrespective of their age, weren't actually interested in them. So we got one example here of what the teacher called irresponsible teens. And one teacher said they were still struggling to use them in feedback. I tend to use them in feedback quite a lot by asking, did you find this easy or difficult? What did you learn and how can you improve? But some teachers still finding that a bit of a challenge. And while I said that some teachers some students write down the can-do statements, there are some students that don't pay any attention to them at all. One important thing I wanted to gauge from the teachers who had built up this experience using the can-do statements was whether or not they had any advice for me or for the school going forward on how we might pass them on to others and how we might try to, educate other teachers when it comes to using them. And one thing that came out, it's a nice way to show students that you've planned, that you've thought about the lesson, that you've really pinpointed on why they're doing something. So that was quite an interesting outcome, something that I hadn't considered before. Another teacher said they enjoyed the ritual of using can-do statements, but there are some questions that we have to address. What if one teacher said that if there was a last-minute cover, would they be easy to use or not? It's an interesting thing to ponder. And another teacher noticed that in some books, especially in French and Spanish books, they already have can-do statements. I think Empower also has can-do statements at the top of the page. So these are quite easy to lift out of the material that we already have and put them on the board and make them explicit for our learners. So, but be brief was the advice, and it's something that resonated with me because I sometimes realize that my can-do statements are quite long. It describe a holiday that you've recently had using blah 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 actually can take up quite a bit of the board. So be brief was something that I recognized is something to work on when using can-do statements. But what was really positive was that overall there was an 85% score on when we asked teachers whether they'd continue using can-do statements going forward. They also, obviously from their feedback, let us know that we need to give more training or give more thought to how to create them, how better to transmit them. So how do you tell students in a plain, digestible way about what the lesson's going to achieve and why they should be there in the first place, and also whether we're able to adapt it for younger learners. Obviously, the challenge with that is adults have a certain cognitive ability to understand certain things, or like a conceptual ability, to understand certain things. Whereas to tell a young learner, or maybe they're 6 or 7, that today you're going to talk about past experiences using the past simple, it's not something that they're able to understand, and nor probably after you've finished the lesson, when you ask them for feedback or you do something at the end of the lesson, using that can-do statement is entirely useless. So something we need to investigate is whether we can adapt the can-do statement to the context of teaching young learners or very young learners. And that's something that we'll certainly be thinking about from now until the start of the next academic year. And we'll continue training teachers on that and see how they progress. So thank you very much for what must have been a whirlwind. I think I have 2 minutes if anyone has any questions. Doesn't seem that there's any questions, but a problem with the technology, as is the case. Oh, that's good, Susan. And yeah, I found that for the most part, teachers have enjoyed probably being able to simplify the whole idea of their lessons, which I didn't necessarily expect to be the case, or it wasn't something that I had in mind. Or an art, that's interesting. And there's certainly something that can be difficult to formulate. So I suppose getting them right is is key. So if there are no questions, I'll hand back to Sean, I suppose. Can-do statements are a part of our course plans. That is really, really interesting. It's really interesting. I think probably in the future there'll be more, or as we move forward to student-centered learning, there'll be more of a focus on things like what exactly are your aims, and teachers might find can-do statements useful in this respect. Yeah, and I agree, Susan. Absolutely.
So obviously, some people use them and some people don't. Did you buy the discussion there, Raul? But it was interesting to see how they're how you've incorporated them into IH Moscow there. And of course, if you've got any more questions, Raul will be here for a few more minutes. But
Sure.
if that is the case, we'll if there are no more now, we'll take you off microphone. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for having me.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much for it. The next speaker will be up in about 9 minutes, although they're not in the room yet, which is always gives me a bit of a twitchy time until they are. So we've got about 9 minutes till the next speaker comes up, and hopefully they'll appear in time for their sound check very shortly. And while we're in the break, then let me put on the next